Virtual dimensions. We're going to talk about what they are. First of all, let's define them, describe them, how you can use them in your environment, how we go about creating virtual dimensions, how we can define those, and then just some things to think about while we're setting those up and using them as well. So within Stratum, when we talk about data in general, and then we'll hone in more on what we call master file or descriptive information. In Stratum, there's really two classes of data that are maintained. One, as depicted very simplistically, on the right-hand side is what we call transactional data. So that's the data that's coming in from your invoicing process, looking at open orders, for example, maybe pulling in inventory, budget, whatever. So that data is stored in a separate set of tables by what we call categories. And what's typically stored in those categories from a dimensional standpoint are the codes. So for example, the customer number, the product number, maybe the order number, things like that. But it's really just the codes that are maintained, not descriptive information. And so that descriptive information is stored in another set of tables. We call them master files, but that's where the dimensional information is stored. So one of the processes, typically at night, when we're loading or updating Stratum, is we refresh this master file information. So that's where the processes are looking and grab information about your customers, for example, products, sales organization, salesperson, on and on and on. And so in addition to the customer number, for example, product number, you've got other descriptive information about that particular entity for that dimension. So for customer, you're going to have a customer number, and that's what's used to really tie in to the transactional data. But in addition to the customer number, then obviously you got the name, you have address information, city, state, contact information, whatever it might be. Okay, and you can do this for every dimension. So we talked about customer, same thing with product number. You have product description information. You might have color, length, size kind of information as well. So that information, again, is stored outside of the transactional information. So what makes this really nice is as you need to update that data about your customers or your products or whatever, that can be done separately from your transaction data. Because, again, it's two separate sets of tables. So let's drill in a little bit more on what a virtual dimension is. So in Stratum, like I explained, there's two types of dimensions, one a base, and then one, we call it a virtual. If you look in the Microsoft Analysis Services description of a virtual dimension, it's actually called a hierarchy-enabled attribute relationship, hence why we call it a virtual dimension. As I described in base dimension, those are the dimensions, the customer number, the product number, sales rep number, that are physically stored in those category data tables. When you update that with your invoicing, your inventory information. And those typically represent the value at the time of the transaction. So you're maintaining it for history. Who was the customer you sold a product to? What was the product number? Who's the sales rep for that particular transaction? But as I showed earlier, associated with each of those dimensions, we can have this master file information. And at a minimum, we typically capture the value, so the customer number, a long and a short description. And then optionally, you can have what we call attributes, or we also refer
to them as pickup fields. And again, this can be the address information, the product specifications, whatever. And typically you can have up to 35 of those. Now in some other installations we've gone all the way up to 99 different attributes about a single dimension for different values. Okay, so a virtual dimension now is created from one of those attribute or pickup fields. Okay, it's a virtual in that it's not physically stored in the category data tables. Okay, so it's not what we would call a physical dimension, but it's a value that you can find for that particular value of that particular dimension. So the customer number 123 in the customer dimension field. And what this also typically represents then is the current value for that particular attribute. So again, I may have stored at the time of the transaction that the product ABC classification, for example, was at that time a B. But now, currently, a year later, 6 months later, whatever, that product has now been classified as an A product. Okay, so it gives me the ability to track not only history, but also current. A good example is sales rep, who actually sold a product last year versus whose customer is that today. Okay, and I'm going to show some examples of what we've done on the customer sold to, for example, making attributes like city and state and primary sales rep. Not only make those as attributes for the customer dimension, but also make them virtual dimensions that we can then use within Stratum. Talking a little bit more about a virtual dimension, it acts just like a regular dimension. So you can use it for drilling, searching, filtering. You can use it in calculated measures. You can select it as you drill into a view, being able to aggregate based on different attributes or virtual dimensions. You can set up a user list against them. You can use it for parameter prompting, which I'll show again some examples of that as well. So from a user perspective, they look like just any other dimension that's available to do analysis with. Some things about virtual dimensions. One of the things that we'll talk about is they tend to be used for what I would call self-describing entities. Things where there either isn't a code, or the code / description you can understand what it's about. For example, state abbreviations would be an example. Obviously, cities. Maybe the sales rep. Not so much a code, but the name, right? So really, they're very useful for where you don't need to have a separate code and a corresponding description, which is what you have with a physical dimension. I've got a customer number. I have a name. What's really nice about the virtual dimensions and what it really gives you a lot of analysis capability with, they're very easily changed. As I described early on, they are loaded as part of your master file load. Again, that's separate from your transaction data. So if I find that I want to change something, one of the attributes about a customer, for example, I don't have to go through my years and years and years of history and all the categories that I've got to change that value. All I need to do is update my customer master information for that. And as part of the viewer database processing that happens at night or trickle load or whatever, that automatically gets updated for you. Another thing that we've used it for is it's really great to be able to provide what-if analysis. Maybe I want to do another grouping. I've got my customers into sales regions, for example, and now I'm thinking about rearranging things for 2019, and I want to move customers around. Well, I don't want to change the main customer region in my ERP system that customer is assigned to, but I could probably find another field, and we've done some other things with customers, that I could allocate another value or indicate another value for the 2019 region. Make that an attribute of the customer and bring that in as a virtual dimension. So it's really nice. I'm not affecting any history. I'm not really affecting any of my customer master information. I can now supply this other value that I can use for a virtual dimension. And then again, what's nice is maybe I rearrange those regions, those customers into different regions for 2019, pass it by my boss. They say, nope, that ain't going to work. I can go back in now and change it for the next iteration. So how do we set these virtual dimensions up? Again, I'll show you this online, but this is the connector. So the connector is the middleware piece of Stratum that looks at your database, your relational database, whether it's on Windows or the iSeries, wherever. And it says, here's the definition. And in this case, we're looking at customer sold to. And these are the different attributes that have been defined, or the pickup fields. So I've got address information, city, state, whatnot. So in the connector, I can highlight one of those attributes, and then down at the bottom where the arrow is pointing, it says create a hierarchy. And I just give it a hierarchy name. I'm going to call it city. So now as the viewer database is processed, it goes through its regular stuff that it does, but then it also creates dimensions based on this attribute relationship now. And again, I can create those at most any time. So before we get into looking at that process and then look at viewer, I'll show you some examples of that. Just some things to remember when you're considering using an attribute for a dimension within viewer. First thing is, it only consists of whatever the value is of that attribute. Again, there isn't a separate code, short and long description like a physical dimension. Okay, so if you think about attributes, and you can include pickup fields and attributes in a view, it's just whatever that value is. Okay. So again, they tend to be things that make sense standalone, if you will. It's a city name. It's a yes/no kind of thing. The character limitation on an attribute is 30 long, so it's actually longer than a base dimension, which is only 25. So that gives you a little bit of extra room. The user needs to have access to what I would call the base dimension that virtual is built or generated from. So in our example with customer sold to, city being the new virtual dimension, the user, in order to access that virtual, needs to have access to the base or the customer sold to dimension. As I mentioned before, the attributes can be refreshed at most any time. And it's separate than having to worry about reloading any historical data. So again, it's a real nice feature to be able to change things without affecting your transaction data. And there's some folks out there using Viewer that need to have more than 99 dimensions. That's been the limitation for quite some time. This feature allows you, if you need to get beyond that. Okay. One thing before I jump onto the system to give you some examples. One of the things that we've done with a number of our customers is allow the end user or an admin person access to basically a spreadsheet that allows that person to update information that would be used for virtual dimensions. So it does a couple things. One, they may not have access to, let's say, the customer master, where they want to add some additional analysis fields that they're going to use for virtual dimensions. Or two, that ERP system and the customer master maintenance screen, if you will, just doesn't have the available fields open to be able to do some of the things that we might want to do, like change the sales region for 2019, for example. What we've done as part of that import on a nightly basis is provide a spreadsheet, just a simple spreadsheet in a folder that can be shared, that folks can make those entries. So maybe specify a particular customer number, and this is going to be their 2019 sales region. This might be their 2019 sales rep, for example. And that information can then be pulled into Stratum as well. Okay, let's flip over to the application. First, I'm going to show you the connector. As part of the process, as you define or you set up dimensions, I'm going to go ahead and edit the dimensions. And I'm going to go down to customer sold to, like we were looking at before, and open up this tree structure. Again, here are all the attributes that have been defined for the sold to. So again, these are pieces of information that I can include in views as I look at customer sold tos. If I highlight, like I did on city, this is where I can click this Create Hierarchy button and go ahead and key in what the user is going to see when they go to select that particular dimension. So in this case, customer city. Contact information. Again, we don't use that necessarily in this example as a virtual dimension. So hence, it's not clicked for Create Hierarchy. But as you can see, you can do this for most any of the different attributes or pickup fields. We've got one for credit limit as an example. Province, state is another example. So from an administrative standpoint, we can go through in the connector, click these on. The next time we run the connector process, again typically at night, that virtual will now be available to the user community. So within Viewer then, where I left Viewer, here's Viewer. This guy off. This is version 6.9. I can go ahead and use those dimensions now in a view. So as an example, here's just a very simple view that I've got, and it's done by customer state. So again, state, customer state was one of those attributes. We made it into a virtual dimension, and now I can use it within a view. I can click on it to drill into other dimensions, again, whether they happen to be physical dimension, which in this case customer sold to is, or another virtual, customer city. I can drill into that as well. And as you can see, customer city now is, surprise, surprise, it's the same thing as the attribute value. Okay, but I can use this I can use these virtuals just as I use other physical dimensions. I can drill on them. Okay. That's not real exciting. If I go to create a new view, I'll just show that real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click here, say New View. Different ways that you can add dimensions. Again, right-click, say Edit in Rows as an example. You're going to see the virtual dimensions within the list of dimensions that you can select for your view. So again, I could have customer sold to down here. And then below that was state. Right there. So again, from a user perspective, it looks like just a regular old dimension. I'm going to go ahead and add that one as well. And let me add a regular measure so we get some data. Months. And go ahead and click on that. So there we go. So again, very easy to access the virtual dimensions. There's nothing from a user perspective that makes them look anything different than a regular dimension. Just as a few other examples, virtual dimension here. Again, here's a virtual dimension, and a physical. Okay. Now, one of the things that you'll notice if I open up the View Explorer and I go to, let's open this guy up first. If I right-click and I say Edit the Attribute Relationships, again, those are pickup fields, in this case for the product family. I've got the short and the long description and obviously the code. If I do the same thing for my virtual dimension, you're going to notice that there aren't any. Because again, the difference between a virtual and a physical is it's just the value. There's no separate code and descriptive or any other attributes. Just another example, I've got a view here where I have virtual. Again, it's a customer state, and I've got a user list against it. In this case, it happens to be a user list. And down here, I can say what makes up that user list. And it's the different states, California, Illinois, and Washington. So I can use filters on that. If I go up to the filter screen, again, customer state appears just as it would any other dimension. And then, let's see, we've got, well, here's a good example of using a virtual dimension for both in comparison to show what today's sales rep is versus where it was from a history standpoint. So in this example, I've got customer state. I selected Ohio. The primary salesperson, which is a virtual dimension, happens to be Nicole. But through the years, the person or the salesperson who made the actual sale may be different. So in this case, after 2016, although Nicole was the primary salesperson, in this particular case in 2017, Patrick has been making sales. So again, I can keep track of, from a historical standpoint, who the sales rep was, but then I can also now identify who the primary salesperson is. So again, the distinction between, for the physical dimension, typically is what happened at the time of the transaction. All right, last example, and then we'll open it up to questions, is just, again, using it for being able to use a virtual dimension in a prompt. Again, it acts the same way as using a physical dimension or a regular dimension in prompting. I can go ahead and select, in this case, the different states that I want to include, and go ahead and run my view. Again, I've got a filter on that now based on those particular members of that virtual dimension. So there's a lot of neat uses for virtual dimensions. You see a lot of usage for where you don't have, like I was mentioning before, where you don't have this attribute information about a particular dimension available in your ERP system. We do, one customer in particular, we've got a lot of product-related information. And they use it also because they've acquired different companies. So they may have product families that make sense from, and they haven't standardized across all their ERP systems yet. So they have product families that are really the same, but within their ERP system they have different codes. So what they're able to do now is have corporate-wide values. So they've carved out a pickup field that they put in that these particular products or SKUs belong to this corporate view of their data. Same kind of thing people do for customer information, where customers that you sell to have been acquired or combined or whatever. You've got separate customer numbers, but you want to combine them into a parent or a corporate view. Questions? Anything I can go back over? We'll look at and drill into a little bit more. Other things about Viewer you'd like to ask questions about? Okay. This is, again, version 6.9. It's our latest release. Certainly encourage everyone to look into that if you haven't upgraded already.